While languishing in a Siberian prison, the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky scrawled a short story on the wall of his cell called The Priest and the Devil. In it, the priest is at the gates of hell and the devil accuses him of lying to his followers. "Don't you know that you and the authorities of the state are my representatives on earth?" he asks. At which point, he takes the priest to a factory where people are working in scorching heat, and then he takes the priest to a farm where threshers are choking on the dust, and then he takes the priest to the miserable huts where all of these workers are living, and the priest can't handle it, and he turns away. But the devil isn't done. He promises to take the priest to one more hell, the very worst, he says. He takes the priest to a prison. The story ends with the devil telling the priest, "There can be no worse hell than this. Did you not know it? Did you not know that these men and women whom you are frightening with the picture of a hell hereafter, did you not know that they are in hell right here before they die?" This story is how Emma Goldman opens the fourth essay of her book, Anarchism and Other Essays, this masterwork. Welcome back to Champagne Anarchism. The first three essays, which were all about anarchism and individualism and political violence, and this week we are taking on the next three essays. Now, you do not have to watch this video or listen to this podcast in order. Since this is a book of essays, you can just jump in at whatever point interests you, but there is an introduction video that I recommend that you watch first. That introduction video will give you a background and history of who Emma Goldman was, a little bit of her life story, so I recommend you check that out first before you come to the kind of deep dives on any of these essays. However, you can just jump in wherever you want, and if you want the full thing, you can subscribe over at the Patreon. All of this main feed stuff, this reading series, is completely free. That's over at patreon.com/champagneanarchism, so definitely check that out if you get a chance. This week, we are covering essays on the prison system, patriotism, and the education system, all from an anarchist perspective. So let's just dig right in, starting, of course, with the first essay, or the fourth essay, depending on how you look at it, Prisons, a Social Crime and Failure. In this essay, Goldman is pulling some really interesting statistics from the data of the time, but we are reading this in the modern day. And I really want to make this point, which is that all of the problems that Goldman was talking about in this essay on prisons, which is a fantastic essay, but all of these problems are reflected in the modern day, and many of them have actively gotten worse, and at some points, significantly worse. Before I get into all of this, let me say that the stats I'm pulling come from three main sources. That's the World Prison Brief, the Prison Policy Initiative, and the advocacy group Worth Rises. I will link all three below. They are all incredible. Check out all of their work. It is fantastic. The other thing I should say is that both I and Goldman are talking about the United States primarily. And the United States has a particularly egregious problem with prisons. However, this is very much a global problem. So it's not one where we can sort of just wave it away and say, well, that's a US problem. It is absolutely a US problem, but it's also a worldwide problem. Globally, that we know about, there are about 11 million people in prison or in pretrial detention, and that does not include statistics from places like North Korea, where we just don't have the data, or China, where we don't necessarily have good numbers on pretrial detentions, stuff like that. So that number, the 11 million, is already an incredibly high number. Probably in real life, it's even higher. And the United States incarcerates people at a higher rate than most places, most rich OECD countries. That's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, by the way. If you're not familiar with the OECD, it's this club of very wealthy countries, and Colombia is in there for some reason. So the United States is pretty much at the top of that list, but there are countries that are real monsters for incarceration as well, that go well beyond the US. Places like El Salvador, for example. In El Salvador, almost 1 out of every 100 people is currently incarcerated. And then also ahead of the US in terms of incarceration rates are places like Cuba and Rwanda, etc. But in the United States, things are obviously really, really bad. So the rate of incarceration in the United States, which is normally measured out of every 100,000 people, is about 531. For historical context, when Emma Goldman died in 1940, that number was about 200. So between 1940 and now, I'm recording this video in 2025, we've gone from from 200 people incarcerated per 100,000 to 531. That is an incredible rate, an incredible jump from what was already a very high rate, as Goldman rightly points out. And when you look at the historical trend, what you see is that that number really starts to take off in the 1970s and then accelerates in the 1980s when Reagan's war on drugs gets going. The trend continues into the 1990s when Bill Clinton's crime bill comes around. And then it hits a massive peak in 2009 when various states and the Obama administration finally start a decarceration trend, and that line starts to go down. But this trend is still insane. This chart, by the way, was compiled by the Sentencing Project. So Goldman has seen all of this, but it's all at a smaller scale. Now the trend has really accelerated. And she makes a key observation, which is that with all of these people going to prison, crime is still going up. Now, modern day, we have multiple modern studies that show that this relationship between putting people in prison and the crime rate is very weak, and often it's actually the other way around. And if we think about that, that should actually make a good deal of sense. People put into the prison system are more likely to commit crimes later, and that may be for a few reasons. Those reasons mostly are tied with their stay in prison. So think about this from the perspective of a prisoner. You've been through an incredibly tough time. You have potentially developed or come across some criminal networks while in prison. When you get out, you've lost access typically to good employment opportunities and to good housing opportunities, and often to your family, who may look at you differently or even cut you out of that kind of natural support system. And so you may be forced back into crime just as the best option out of there. Goldman says, with nothing but hunger and inhumanity to greet them, these victims soon sink back into crime as the only possibility of existence. Lest we forget, by the way, let's remember that Goldman herself spent time in prison. By the time she was writing this, she had already spent a year in Blackwell's prison for doubting God and the state, and later on she'll spend even more time in prison and eventually be deported. But in this essay, for example, when she speaks about knowing a woman from Blackwell's prison, this is not some kind of casual acquaintance. Anyway, Goldman in this essay is very interested in the root of crime as a problem. And she quotes Havelock Ellis, who was a British scientist, an early sexologist, one of the first people at the time to seriously study homosexuality and transgenderism. He was also a passionate eugenicist, so, early 1900s, what are you going to do? Anyway, Ellis divides crime into the political, the passional, the insane, and the occasional. Goldman says that often the political criminal has done nothing wrong. These are political prisoners, they've just gone against the state. Of course, Goldman is going to take this perspective, but we make such a big deal, especially in the United States, of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and all of this. So Goldman's argument here makes a good deal of sense, and her own life experience shows us that that makes a lot of sense. The state just imprisons people who have done nothing wrong, they've just spoken up about the state. She also says, rightly, that the insane criminal is not culpable for their actions, and we still have this defense today in the modern legal system. Meanwhile, and this is the more interesting bit, when she talks about the passional and the occasional criminals, what she says is that society has failed them. And that's what Goldman is so preoccupied with in this section, this societal failure. She thinks supporting people rather than imprisoning them will attack the root cause of crime. And that instead of actually tackling crime, what we have built in society through the prison system and what you might these days call the prison industrial complex is a society built around revenge. And this is a really, really important idea. Nowadays, we tend to think of justice systems as either rehabilitative, that is, you are trying to rehabilitate the individual, attack the root causes of crime, or punitive, that is, you're trying to deter crime. You're trying to slap them for having disobeyed the law, and that will get them to obey the law next time. That's a punitive criminal justice system. So in one, the idea is to punish and deter crime, and in the other, the idea is to help the criminal. Goldman, and this should surprise no one, has absolutely no time for a punitive model. In fact, what she has to say here is very personal, and if you read it from the perspective of a regular person kind of attending this lecture or reading this essay around the turn of the 20th century, she says, quote, "The civilized man, stripped of courage and daring, has delegated to an organized machinery the duty of avenging his wrongs, in the foolish belief that the state is justified in doing what he no longer has the manhood or consistency to do. These are pretty crazy words, but what she's saying is, listen, we assume that the state and the judicial system have this kind of higher ability, this special access to impersonal justice. They are not vengeful, they are impartial. But what Goldman is actually saying is, if you look at it, this is just vengeance on a systemic level. And potentially that's why these kind of law and order arguments, and we hear this from politicians all the time, but that's why these law and order arguments appeal to us almost on a primitive level. And then she goes a step beyond, of course. She says, we're taking revenge, and then we're hiding the human consequences of this revenge away. She talks about torture in prisons, which absolutely still happens, by the way, but maybe not necessarily to the extent of the late 19th century, but it's absolutely still with us. And she says this, she says, quote, "Prison walls rarely allow the agonized shrieks of the victims to escape. Prison walls are thick, they dull the sound. Society might with greater immunity abolish all prisons at once than to hope for protection from these 20th century chambers of horrors." Sorry about that, just had to deal with a crying puppy for a sec. Anyway, what was I saying? That's right, that is what Emma Goldman is calling for, is the absolute abolition of prisons. She has this really interesting line where she says that reformers are doing good work, but it's like pouring good wine into musty bottles. And if that idea of prison abolition sounds familiar, it probably should. We find echoes of this in the work of Angela Davis. By the way, we will be reading Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle later for this book series, but for now, let's just talk about Angela Davis and prisons. Davis says that although, of course, first off, you don't need a set of alternatives to go and abolish the prison system. However, most of what we try to do through the modern prison system can be done through other means, and often more humane means. And that makes a lot of sense. So think about it. What are the primary drivers of crime? Typically, these drivers are said to be things like poverty, mental illness, unemployment, substance abuse, family issues, childhood problems and childhood conditions, and occasionally the sort of culture that you grew up in. If crime was innate, that is to say, if it was just something that you were born to do, then it would make sense that prison could be some kind of deterrent. But if crime is formed through all of these other issues, that doesn't make any sense. If crime and criminal behavior is just something that you learn or something that you're forced into, think of Jean Valjean stealing bread to feed his family in Les Miserables, then prison will only serve to make your miserable life more miserable. To treat crime, then, you need to tackle the root of the problem, and you need to approach crime with compassion. That's where Davis comes down on it, and Goldman is very similar in her thinking here. We should mention, by the way, before we leave this essay, Goldman, near the end of this essay, has sort of an admonition, a warning to the organized labor movement not to oppose decent pay for prison workers. She says that prisons, if they are to exist, should provide kind of an exit, right? They should provide skills training and real wages to people in them, not just slave labor. Nowadays, we have a lot of work that actually confirms this idea. From people like Angela Davis to Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow. In many states across the US, prisons, and especially private prisons, rely on forced labor to extract profit. It's essentially a system of modern slavery. We are literally talking forced labor, and workers are paid pennies to do incredibly difficult jobs. And then private companies at the top are profiting from that labor. And this is one of those instances where Goldman, the effects that she was seeing back then, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, have just become part of the regular system now. They've been industrialized. Now, those things, those relations that she saw back then, exist on an industrial scale. I could probably rant about prisons for another 3 hours here, but we should move on to the next essay. So let's here turn our attention to the second essay we're looking at here today, the fifth in the book. This is, of course, Patriotism, a Menace to Liberty. And once again, right at the start, Goldman is referencing another famous Russian. This time, Leo Tolstoy, who she calls the greatest anti-patriot of our times. And she quotes a few people here. Tolstoy defined patriotism as the principle that will justify the training of wholesale murderers. And she also quotes Samuel Johnson, who says that patriotism is the last resort of scoundrels. And Gustav of the French politician who says that patriotism is a superstition. And then Goldman herself comes in at this point and she says, and I love this, she says, patriotism assumes that our globe is divided into little spots, each one surrounded by an iron gate. Those who have had the fortune of being born on some particular spot consider themselves better, nobler, grander, more intelligent than the living beings inhabiting any other spot. It is, therefore, the duty of everyone living on that chosen spot to fight, kill, and die in the attempt to impose his superiority upon all the others. This violence, by the way, is the main thing that Goldman is worried about. When it comes to patriotism, it's the violence that's the issue. She blames patriotism for this increase that she's seen in military spending, and she also has this key insight here, which is that patriotism really is for the masses. It is not for the wealthy. We can think about this a little bit in the present day, right? People go off, regular people, they go off and they fight and die for their country. Meanwhile, the wealthy are happy to hide the profit that they've extracted from that country in other countries, in other jurisdictions, in foreign jurisdictions where they're avoiding paying taxes on it, taxes that would go back to the home country. Patriotism and the patriotic ideals that I think we're all to some extent instilled with, those are not for the wealthy. They are ultimately just tools of the powerful. In fact, she takes this a step further. She says that a gorgeous army and navy is like a toy to the masses. And that's why governments around the world spend so much on their militaries. And we can hear echoes of Frantz Fanon in this, by the way. We read Frantz Fanon when we read The Wretched of the Earth, and you can go back on that Patreon and listen to those episodes. But Fanon says that a nationalist leader who can't deliver for their people will retreat to symbols and fancy military parades. This is ultimately the same kind of thinking. Of course, as you read this essay, you may notice one point where Goldman just is catastrophically wrong. And that's the bit where she says that the major nations of the world will never actually go to war with one another because they know each other's interests. Militarism is just, in her thinking, just a bone to throw to the masses. However, she is writing just a few years out from World War I kicking off in Europe. World War I, to my mind, is actually a fairly good example of the link between patriotism and militarism. It is possibly one of the stupidest wars in history. It's one of those occasions where the rich aristocrats of Europe seemed to think that war was this glorious thing. In the build-up to World War I, they thought that war could be like it was in the stories, that it could be honorable and glorious. Then they very quickly learned that war wasn't really glorious anymore. Not that it ever was, but it really, really wasn't glorious then. All those knights and archers in the old stories had been replaced by machine guns and trenches. And the violence that Europe had previously been able to just sort of export to the periphery, all of a sudden they got to experience it firsthand back home. In one of the bloodiest wars in the history of time, by the way. So I don't think that Goldman's thrust here is wrong, even though this particular line in the book is absolutely titanically wrong. Ultimately, her point, and this is absolutely right, is that war is sort of a playground for the powerful. So, of course, when she says that the nations of the world will not go to war with each other, that's not accurate, but not because her underlying argument is necessarily wrong. By the way, it's also kind of worth remembering this idea when we hear arguments that used to be a lot more popular with people when they would talk about globalization. The people that got very, very excited about globalization at the tail end of the 90s and early 2000s, we're talking post-fall of the Soviet Union, fall of the Berlin Wall. The theory was at the time, and often still is that if countries are trading with each other, if we just increase the amount of commerce between nations and the amount of contact, the kind of cultural overlap between different countries, then we can avoid war forever. If, for example, I'm watching TikTok videos on a Chinese app and seeing videos that are being created by people from around the world, when it comes time for the US to go to war with China, I will reasonably say, well, no, I don't want to go to war with China. I know many Chinese people. I've seen Chinese people. I know that these people are not evil. But war isn't really about that. And we should know that from Chomsky, by the way. War is ultimately a game for the powerful, and that patriotism that Goldman is so resoundingly criticizing in this essay, that patriotism really matters for that calculation. Consent for war, we learned from Chomsky, can be manufactured, and it's manufactured by and on behalf of the elites. So this globalization argument and interconnectedness, while it sounds really nice, has never made all that much sense to me. Either way, we can't talk about patriotism here without talking about profit. And on this point, Goldman is very, very clear. Towards the end of this essay, she has a brilliant line, which is, the greatest bulwark of capitalism is militarism. She says that it's no coincidence that during periods of industrial depression, there is a huge uptick in conscription. We can also think with modern eyes about this phenomenon, about, for example, World War II, where this build-up, this massive military spending that came around that time, ended up pulling the U.S. out of the Great Depression. War is ultimately great for business, and patriotism, therefore, serves as a perfect backstop in justifying war and boosting our economy. Now, at the end of the essay, she is wrong again. She says the proletariat of Europe has realized the danger of patriotism and has inaugurated a war against it, and Americans will follow suit. This was wishful thinking. Of course, it never happened, but it was a beautiful dream, and it's how she ends this essay on patriotism. And that, by the way, takes us to the third and final essay that we'll be covering today. And this, to me, is actually probably one of the most interesting essays in this entire book. This is Francisco Ferrer and the Modern School. Now, most of this essay is spent talking about the life and martyrdom of Francisco Ferrer, who was an anarchist teacher and the founder of the Barcelona Modern School. So let's talk about Ferrer for a sec. Francisco Ferrer y Guardia was born in Alella, that's near Barcelona, and he grew up influenced by this kind of, especially around Barcelona at the time, these very liberal ideals that put him very much at odds with the rest of Spain. This, at the time, is called Restauración Spain. This is the Spain of the Restoration. This is this very strange period in Spanish history between two republics, that is to say, democracies that replaced monarchies. And just a couple of years after that, the dictator Francisco Franco, who you've probably heard about, takes power in Spain. This period, by the way, is the Spanish Civil War, where you have a lot of very good examples and particularly fascinating stories of anarchist communes rising up to fight against the fascists. This is a period that Emma Goldman, by the way, takes a direct interest in and travels to Barcelona and starts propagandizing almost for the movement and the CNT at the time. But you can get more detail on that in the introduction lecture. For now, let's focus on the period before that, Restoration Spain and Ferrer himself. Ferrer goes into a brief period of exile in France, and Goldman talks about this period and the influences of Louis Michel, people that he meets over there. But he comes back to Spain. He comes back to Barcelona, and it's there that he founds the Modern School, the Escola Moderna. And that happens in 1901. This school only lasts about 5 years until Ferrer's death. And the school is fascinating, and at the time, it is revolutionary. It is centering children in its teaching methods. It's centering critical thinking. It's introducing a more inclusive environment for experimentation. All of this, by the way, free of religious control at a time when the Catholic Church is very much ascendant in Spain. It's doing away with some of the older forms of schooling, the kind of rote memorization, just sitting down, memorizing facts, spitting them out for a test, that kind of model, which, by the way, we still get a lot of today. Instead, in Ferrer's school, there was a lot more hands-on learning, a lot more experiences, and it was a curriculum that was steeped in kind of progressive values of the time. If all of this sounds familiar, there are plenty of schools now that essentially replicate what the Modern School was doing back then. A lot of people who take Ferrer's teaching and his thought and apply it to a modern curriculum. But these schools, not necessarily, but often, they will cater to the super wealthy. And Ferrer, of course, was doing it for sliding scale tuition. So whatever the parents of the child could afford, that's what he would charge them. His approach quickly gained some fervent supporters, especially among working class families who were eager for change. And at the same time, he made some very determined enemies, mostly the Spanish state and the Catholic Church, and at the time in Spain that was enough to get you killed. Ferrer was swept up in the upheaval of the time. There was a violent uprising in Barcelona. Goldman, of course, says he has nothing to do with it. Whether or not that's completely true is sort of up for historical debate. He probably wasn't kind of the inciting cause, but he may have been involved in some capacity. We're not really sure. Either way, he gets arrested. After he's arrested, he's accused of inciting rebellion, and he's executed. Because of that execution, he became something of a martyr, and after death, his movement really continued to build. But Goldman, as she's telling us this story, it gives us a bit of a window onto her thoughts on the modern school and what an anarchist education might look like. And the first thing to say here is that if you want to build an anarchist society or a community that's based on anarchist principles, education is key. It reminds me of this idea that in a revolution, someone has to be on the front line, but also someone has to bring the potato salad. You cannot fight for a better world with soldiers alone. You need doctors, you need cooks, you need writers, you need childminders, and most of all, you need teachers. With this in mind, Goldman quotes Ferrer here when he says, "I am not a speaker, not a propagandist, not a fighter. I am a teacher. I love children above everything. I think I understand them. I want my contribution to the cause of liberty to be a young generation ready to meet a new era." And the other important idea here has to do with the nature of education itself. So in a passage where she talks about the accusation that he taught children to hate God, she said that if he didn't believe in God, why teach the children to hate something that didn't exist? She says, "Is it not more likely that he took the children out into the open, that he showed them the splendor of the sunset, the brilliancy of the starry heavens, the awe-inspiring wonder of the mountains and seas, that he explained to them in his simple, direct way the law of growth, of development, of the interrelation of all life? In so doing, he made it forever impossible for the poisonous weeds of the Catholic Church to take root in the child's mind." You know, for Goldman, and I think most anarchists, the root of education is really exploration. It's about teaching a way of life and a curiosity that just simply isn't present in modern education systems most of the time throughout most of the world. These systems are mainly built around this idea that we need to train competent and patriotic as well. Remember, patriotic workers. If you cast your mind back, if you think about your favorite teachers, these were probably people who were running against the grain, running against the curriculum that they were handed by the school system. And the way that's set up is really, really sad. But running up against the grain, that's what Goldman's after here. This sort of essay, I've said it's one of my favorites in the book, but it's not really an essay. It might be more properly called hagiography. This is kind of the writing of the lives of saints. This essay has a very specific aim in mind, and it's to elevate Francisco Ferrer to the level of a martyr. It's trying to bring him up to a saint-like status and cement his martyrdom, and I think that it succeeds. We can just look at one of the final lines of the essay where Goldman speculates about Ferrer's death. And listen, I have no research to suggest that she would have any idea about his final moments. But whatever, let's not let the truth get in the way of a good line. We'll end with this. She says, "Francisco Ferrer needed no lying priest to give him courage, nor did he upbraid a phantom for forsaking him. The consciousness that his executioners represented a dying age, and that this was the living truth, sustained him in the last heroic moments." Again, as far as I know, this is pure speculation. It makes for an excellent line, but it may be completely made up. However, it does make us think about Ferrer and his crusade for education, and this idea that he was consoled in his final moments by the fact that the forces that he was fighting were part of a dying world, and that he and his death would be the spark of a new one. Anyway, thank you as always for watching. We will be back next week, and next week we are talking about the following 3 essays, which means that we'll be talking all about feminism. Why does Emma Goldman disagree with the movement to give women the vote? We will find out next week. As always, all of this is available on the Patreon feed, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. Let me know what you think, either here, directly, socials, whatever it is. I will see you next week. Thank you very much for watching.